We've been adopting the lenses of mimetic studies in order to try to make sense of the case of Thiel, his technological investment, his promotion of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, his theory of the Antichrist, which are all addressed in the previous episodes. And now I turn to Palantir. And it's an indication that the mirror of mimesis sees deeper than often realized. As I mentioned in the preceding episode, is that Thiel had already founded, or actually co-founded, with his Stanford friend Alex Karp, Palantir in 2003, so before writing the Straussian moment. What he did with Palantir was transfer technologies of fraud recognitions that were operative in PayPal, his previous company, in a data mining company that would assemble and analyze data coming from different sources in order to prevent terrorist attacks like 9/11. So Palantir is the technology of espionage that Thiel had been explicitly addressing. It is the echelon of the Straussian moment. With the suspension of natural rights, it potentially entails. So let's remember that. And the goal of this presentation is also indeed to keep in mind that Thiel is a chess player, and so he announces his moves in all fairness, and so we can trace some of the possible moves that will follow if you are aware of the genealogy of his ideas. Now, the government, strangely enough, the CIA in particular, was Palantir's first client. I say surprisingly because Thiel is a self-proclaimed libertarian who doesn't want government intervention, and yet is willing to put his technology to governmental use and maybe also abuse because of the ideology that drives his thoughts. So it's not simply a question of investments in companies that make money, since Palantir benefits were relatively small for a long period, but it is a company that is political from the very beginning, and it is explicitly aimed at preventing terroristic attacks, which seems indeed a noble enterprise. You might remember that the term Palantir is a seeing stone that comes straight out of Lord of the Rings, a book that Thiel has read numerous times and that informs his companies. We talked about Mithril, Palantir, and so forth. And so it is a mirror, but it is a special mirror in the sense that Palantir is a special mirror in the sense that it doesn't simply represent reality as it is. It's also not a mirror in the sense that, like Facebook, it amplifies mimetic desires via an algorithmic logic. Rather, Palantir is what I would call a hypermimetic mirror, in the sense that it integrates data from different sources available online in order to propose courses of action offline. So it is a mirror that guides actions and that lead simulations online to have direct effects offline. This is indeed what programs like Gotham or Maven that are part of Palantir are used in different wars. And remember, wars very often distinguish between friends and enemies, as Carl Schmitt had pointed out. Now, it is of course tempting to think that Palantir is on the hands of friends only, since that's what both Peter Thiel and Alex Karp constantly emphasize. It is used for U.S. national security. It was used against Al-Qaeda. There is rumors about whether Palantir was used to find and kill Bin Laden. It was used during the coronavirus. So obviously, as a technology, it can be very helpful. And it is also used in the war in the Ukraine. A war of Russian invasion in which indeed we can, as friends, identify with the Ukrainians. So the technology itself is neither good nor bad. It's what in Greek you could call a pharmakon. It can be a remedy, but the term pharmakon, which I was very familiar with, it's linked to Derrida's notion of the pharmakon. The term pharmakon can also be a poison. Now, aficionados of The Lord of the Rings will remember that in The Lord of the Rings it is primarily Saruman who uses Palantir in order to join forces with Mordor. And so it's an example in which the distinction between friends and enemies is far from stable, in which a former friend turns into an enemy of the hobbits and the elves and the eco-friendly figure. Remember that Gandalf tells Saruman that a Palantir is a dangerous tool. You never know who is watching. So this is a lesson that we should indeed remember, especially given what we have seen so far. Now, if we step back and summarize what we have learned, we have seen that Thiel has explicit anti-democratic tendencies, that he played a major role in the first election of Donald Trump, and that he was the main force that allowed for J.D. Vance entry in politics and his positioning as vice president on the chessboard of politics. He disregards the risks of scapegoating and the nonviolent implications of Girard's thoughts, and instead tends to rely implicitly on Schmitt's distinction between friends and enemies. And he supplements the distinction with the Straussian idea that in order to respond to violence, technologies of surveillance like Palantir that would suspend natural rights, as Strauss puts it, are needed. And then on top of that, there is this apocalyptic, pessimistic bent that leads Thiel to speak of Armageddon and especially of the Antichrist. And so given all these elements, a lot of people online have been wondering, is then Peter Thiel the Antichrist? It's a legitimate question, even though one doesn't need to embrace this terminology. I say it's legitimate because in an interview with the New York Times, Thiel was asked whether humanity was worth saving, and he had a very long hesitation on that simple question, saying, oh, it's all complicated and so forth. So it took him quite some time to answer eventually, okay, yes, so this is not a question where somebody in a position of such power should hesitate. But still, I would suggest that we should be careful not to fall into the temptation to simply designate Thiel as the Antichrist, since that would be the exact same logic that he is promoting, and mimetic studies is opening up alternative perspectives, also atheological perspectives that don't rely on clear-cut distinctions between good and evil. So while there are ample reasons to be worried about Thiel's techno-political influence via pawns or actually Trojan horses like Vance and Palantir, mimetic studies suggest that we shouldn't fall prey to apocalyptic despair. Instead, what this diagnostic reveals, or tries to reveal, is that it's urgent for new democratic policies to emerge from both the bottom up and to be implemented also from the government, from the top down, to contain the pathological excesses of both new fascism and AI technologies. And here I'd like to conclude with the case of the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, who he refused to allow the CIA and the government, by extension, to use Claude AI, to be integrated with Palantir, and for good reason. In fact, his recent quarrel with the Department of War argued that there should be limits to the use of AI in the 21st century. These limits include mass surveillance of population, which will lead to loss of basic freedoms or natural rights, as Strauss had put it, and the development of fully autonomous weapons, which would lead to wars to escalate to extremes. So these are the two conditions Amodei put, and the Trump administration wasn't willing to comply with this very minimum. So to conclude, I find Amodei's recent manifesto revealing, not in the sense of apocalypse or revelation, but of the apocalyptic figure he implicitly addresses. After refusing to comply with the Department of War for fear of anti-democratic use of Claude AI, Amodei opens his new manifesto by cautioning against, I quote him, thinking about AI in quasi-religious ways. And then in an esoteric message that we can now fully decode, he adds in a footnote, I quote him, prophecies of salvation and prophecies of doom are unhelpful for confronting the real world. So it is with this idea that I would like to conclude, and as we continue diagnosing the pathologies of Homo mimeticus 2.0, I suggest we should be careful with binary evaluations that oppose friends and enemies, good and evil. It is thus with this down-to-earth message in mind that mimetic studies will continue to look into technological mirrors to orient ourselves in the present with an eye toward a still indeterminate and hopefully non-apocalyptic future. Thanks for your attention.